Chapter 9. The Kingdom. Forever and ever? To this day, if I had to single out the two best years of my life, I would choose 1942 to early 1944. That period, 1942 in particular, was the most promising time ever for young Germans. Our country stood at the pinnacle of its power. This was the largest German empire the world had ever known. I was absolutely certain that only a glorious death on the battlefield would keep me from being part of the final victory. The largest German empire the world had ever known stretched from the northern tip of Finland, completely through Europe, and into North Africa. In the west, the empire began at the French coast of the Atlantic Ocean, extended east across Europe, and into parts of Russia held by the German army. The Allies now feared that German troops in Russia might connect with those in North Africa, sweep east through Asia, and join Japan to overtake the world. It was a picture of power to the Hitler Youth. This was a time of unparalleled glory. The German armies in Russia might be having trouble, but it was temporary. In the end, it would be Deutschland über alles. Nothing could tarnish the teenagers' vision of total victory for the Nothing could tarnish teenagers' visions of total victory for the fatherland. Germany was a world power, and its young people were proud and patriotic. If there was a dark side to Adolf Hitler or a reason to fear the future, they were blind to both. At 14, we left the Jungvolk and were sworn into the senior branch, the Hitlerjugend. The ceremony usually took place on Hitler's birthday, April 20th. Most of the Jungvolk joined the Allgemeine, the general Hitler Youth. But there were other options. If a boy wanted to exert himself, the Motor Hitlerjugend taught motor mechanics and driving. The Marine Hitlerjugend was training ground for the Navy, teaching boating and navigation. But by far, the most prestigious and most demanding was the Flieger Hitlerjugend, the Junior Air Force. Fewer than 100,000 of the nearly 5 million Hitler Youth members belonged to it. It was the elite. Still, I was not too excited when I had the chance to join. "Do you think I should accept?" I asked one of my teachers. "Why not?" he replied in some astonishment. "Doesn't it beat slogging around in the General Hitler Youth?" "Maybe so," I said, "but I'm not crazy about heights." "Don't be dumb, Heck," he advised. "Aim for the Luftwaffe." It was true that nearly all the German Air Force pilots started their training in the Flieger Hitlerjugend. It was an exciting time to learn to fly. This was the first war in which air power played a major role. During World War I, both sides recognized the potential and promise of airplanes. German flying ace Baron von Richthofen, the Red Baron, had won fame for shooting down nearly 80 British aircraft. But these old biplanes were primitive. Technology had not then caught up with man's visions. By World War II, however, aircraft had moved into a new age. Air power, not horses or tanks, was the new force in modern warfare. Thousands of men and boys were ready and anxious to train. So many, in fact, that the German Air Force could be quite choosy. Only those in superb physical condition with good character and education were considered. 3 days before our Easter vacation, I received a registered letter from the headquarters of the Hitler Youth, ordering me to report to the glider camp, Lenghor, a former Luftwaffe base, just 4 miles south of Wittlich. I was ecstatic at the news, but my grandmother exploded with rage. She didn't like the idea of a 14-year-old flying, and was quick to remind me that the air has no beams. I followed orders nevertheless. The first day in Camp Wengerhor went by like a blur. There were various grades of gliding certificates, all which required a number of flights. The first grade was level A. On a cool, gusty April day, I made my first flight. Strapped down on the wooden seat of the basic glider, the SG-38, it was nothing more than an open, laminated plywood beam with wings. After a reassuring tap on my helmet, our leader lifted his arm. 20 of my comrades grabbed a thick rubber rope and catapulted me into the air like a stone in a giant slingshot. The grass rushed at me, I pulled back on the stick, and I was airborne. The flight took no longer than a minute, but I was hooked. From that moment on, I knew I never would become a priest. Those first 3 weeks of flight training gave my life a firm direction. Although I was just 14, I not only knew what I wanted to do with my future, I was willing to work hard for it. I didn't mention my plans to my grandmother, of course, but I was determined to join the Luftwaffe as a cadet and future pilot as soon as I was old enough. The Luftwaffe was the pride of the German military. From the time it was established in 1933, it drew the best men, materials, and money that the Reich could provide. The Luftwaffe soon became the envy of airmen worldwide. Even America's flying hero, Charles Lindbergh, was awed. He made several trips to Germany to inspect the Air Force and became close friends with Luftwaffe leader Hermann Goering. Upon returning from one trip, Lindbergh announced that the German Air Force was invincible. It could not be beaten. Goering was the most popular of all Nazi leaders. An enormous man with an enormous ego, he ultimately became Reichsmarschall of Großdeutschland, Greater Germany, the number 2 man in the Reich under Hitler. Goering ran the Luftwaffe with pride and precision, but in his private life he showed little self-control. He dressed expensively and often drank and ate to excess. To ease his digestive problems, he used a morphine-based drug, to which he became addicted. He also gathered a fine collection of art, much of it stolen from Jews in German-occupied countries. It was Goering's Luftwaffe that had performed the Polish Blitzkrieg in 1939. It was the Luftwaffe that had helped to destroy the Dutch army in 1940, after just 4 days of fighting. Early in the Battle of Britain, all eyes were focused on the Luftwaffe. It performed like no other air force in history. Within the German military, the army and navy were strong, but the Luftwaffe was spectacular. Little wonder, then, that so many boys were willing to give everything, even their lives, to be a part of it. My transformation from an average member of the Hitler Youth to a fanatic believer in the master race began with my promotions in the Flieger Hitlerjugend. My advancement was based on good flying, but there was more. The Hitler Youth was always on the lookout for good leaders, and my dedication beyond the call of duty did not go unnoticed. My dream was to become a fighter ace in the Luftwaffe, but first I had to earn my higher ratings. I bicycled down to Wengerrohr to try and get in an extra flight. Often I spent all day in the camp kitchen, scrubbing pans or peeling potatoes in return for one single flight at dusk. In friendly competition with me was Rabbit, a pale-faced boy on my flight team. He and I were slated to take our B rating test on the same day. By means of a powerful diesel winch that jerked the glider off the ground, we were towed up to a height of 800 feet. One rode this aircraft vertically into the sky with the stick pulled back against the seat. I had a rough landing, but Rabbit and I got perfect scores on the flight part of the test flight. Despite my extra flights between courses, I had a tough time keeping up with him. Rabbit was a natural airman, sniffing the wind like an old hound dog before a flight. He was the only glider pilot I ever met who never had to repeat a test flight even once. Outside the Flieger Hitlerjugend, the German military picture was not so promising. Many Germans were beginning to question Der Führer's decisions. The Russian campaign was deemed a disaster. By October 1942, the Wehrmacht was fighting for its life near the city of Stalingrad, on the frozen plains of Russia. Winter came howling in for the second year on an army not yet recovered from the first. Winter came howling in for the second year on an army not yet recovered from the first. Losses of men and machinery were tremendous, and fuel was hard to find. The Luftwaffe had failed to airlift supplies to troops stuck near Stalingrad, leaving the German army stranded in battle against the fiercely fighting Russian troops. In North Africa, the tide was also turning against the Reich. Earlier in the war, the brilliant German general Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had overrun Allied forces in Africa and moved his men to the very border of Egypt. But early in 1942, the Allies struck back. For the first time, British troops defeated the Germans. Rommel lost 38,000 men to death, injury, or the vastness of the Sahara Desert. The defeat struck a tremendous blow to the fighting spirit of German soldiers and generals. Fighting continued throughout the summer, climaxing in late October at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. After 12 days of savage warfare, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery announced a total victory over the Germans. The Desert Fox had suffered a devastating defeat. Meanwhile, the situation in Russia steamrolled toward catastrophe. Though temperatures of negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit blasted the barren plains, Hitler ordered his troops to dig in and await relief. Relief never came. Without ever uttering the word defeat, the German government at last announced an end to the fighting. The German government at last announced an end to the fighting in Russia on February 3, 1943. It consoled its people by saying, "The sacrifices of the army were not in vain." The announcement was followed by 3 days of national mourning, during which all businesses were ordered to close. We were so conditioned to believe in the Einsiege, final victory, that no setback could have shaken my confidence. I was sure that Germany would eventually win the war. Still, I could not dismiss the loss of the entire Sixth Army at Stalingrad without some concern, especially since it followed so closely on the heels of our losses in North Africa. When Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad, it set Hitler into a rage. He ordered the Deutschlandsender to play Chopin's Funeral March over the national radio, a way of saying that he had written off the last of his men still stranded there. Only 5,000 of 300,000 German soldiers fighting the Russia campaign ever returned to Germany. The Hitler Youth now stepped up its pre-military training. Shortly after the period of national mourning, I was ordered to attend a weapons course in Wittlich. Rifles were nothing new to us. From the age of 10, we had been instructed in small caliber weapons. But this was different. We spent most of the day on the rifle range, but we also learned to throw live hand grenades and fire bazookas at dummy tanks. During the last 2 days of the course, we were introduced to the MG-41, a machine gun that could fire 1,000 rounds of ammunition per minute. Suddenly, it seemed like the action was getting closer to home. The casualty lists were growing longer, and yet, although the war was beginning to get grim for us, I remained strangely upbeat. I had just been promoted to Scharführer, which put me in charge of 50 boys. I was positive, optimistic. The Nazi regime had molded me successfully, for despite our losses, I could still believe in nothing but total victory.